we've got Professor Neil Levy with us, which is fantastic. Some of you may already know Neil from previous events. He works on autonomy in decision-making amongst a range of other things. And he's currently the leader of a large AHRC project in decision-making. And I'll pop the link to the project page in the chat in a minute in case somebody wants to go and have a look at that and the research papers that are coming out of it. So Neil's been with us in the Uehiro Centre since 2006. And he's currently splitting his time between us here in Oxford and Macquarie University in Australia, which is where he is now. So Neil, I think it's about 9:30 for you in the evening there. We have got people joining us from all around the world. We've got people in South Africa, people in Canada, people in Greece. So you don't get all the sympathy, but thank you so much for joining us and making the time this evening. So I'll hand over to you. And as general, everybody, if you could mute your microphones and put your questions in the chat or keep them for the end, and we'll get to them then. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Liz. You can probably hear that I don't have a cold or anything like that, but I've recovered several weeks ago from one, and my voice is still croaky. And if I start coughing, I apologize. I'm not actually infectious, even if you're in the room, but I don't think anyone's ever caught anything over Zoom. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. This is something a little different, but this is my current work, and I think it's a really interesting topic too. It's applied ethics adjacent rather than what is normally thought of as applied ethics. Sometimes I think of it as applied epistemology. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy concerned with knowledge. Episteme in Greek is knowledge. So applied epistemology is about practical questions in getting knowledge. And the question I'm particularly concerned with today is how we decide for ourselves in a world of experts. So it's a familiar fact about modern life that we live in a world in which there are experts. Experts, roughly, are people who know a lot more than we do about a particular topic, and not only know more, but they have more skills in that area. So you might be an expert in something. No matter how expert you are, even if you happen to be a Nobel Prize winner, you still have this problem, because no matter how much of an expert you are, there are still lots of people who know lots of things you don't. So we're all novices compared to some experts. And most of us, I think really all of us, are novices compared to a huge range of experts. Why does that matter? Well, we've got to make up our mind, not only about what to believe, because you could, if you wanted, be agnostic about lots of things, and some philosophers actually advise agnosticism, but you've got to make up your mind about what to do. So it's a practical question. So, for example, almost all of us, if we're not feeling well, we go to a doctor. Why do we go to a doctor? Because we think the doctor is an expert about health. They know more about what might be wrong with us than we do. Your car's making a weird noise. You think a mechanic is an expert compared to you, and they have the skills to diagnose the problem, if anyone does. Just checking the chat in case there was anything I needed. So we've all got to make these decisions. And, this has been a really pressing problem, or an obvious problem, in the context of the pandemic. So in the pandemic, experts were giving us advice, but lots of people were saying it was bad advice. It certainly was costly advice. That is to say that, the advice to quarantine, to wear a mask, to get a vaccine, all of these things had some downside. So if the experts were wrong, it was important to know. And of course, if the experts were very wrong, some people said the vaccines were dangerous. The experts were very wrong. It was important to know. You had to make a decision: vaccinate, don't vaccinate. You go to the mechanic and they say, sorry, there's something really seriously wrong with your car. You're going to have to spend £1,800 getting it fixed. Well, the mechanic knows a lot more about cars than I do. But on the other hand, I know the mechanic has incentives to deceive me. If there's nothing wrong with my car, really, maybe it just needs a filter change or something like that, they could say, oh, that's, 6 hours work and £600 in parts, and just take the money for doing 20 minutes work and a £10 filter change. So people have incentives to deceive us. Even experts sometimes disagree. We're vulnerable in relation to experts. That is to say, they give us advice which bears on what we should do, often in important ways. And it's hard for us to know if that advice is good. I think, just looking at the base rates, most of the time people aren't trying to deceive us. Also, there are systems in place to accredit experts, and you hope those systems work. So most of the time you can probably go along with the experts, but still, you might worry that here's a particular case where I should get a second opinion, or maybe do something else. What else can we do? Okay, well, here's a joke. It's a pretty weak joke, but it's the best I've got. How many conspiracy theorists does it take to change a light bulb? Do your own research. Explaining a joke kills it, but I think this one's, on its last legs anyway, so I'm going to take the risk. So any humor that is in this joke comes from the fact that conspiracy theorists on social media quite familiarly say, don't just trust the advice of the CDC or who was it, Chris Whitty, who used to stand on the podium with Boris Johnson and tell us what to do, or take the advice of the scientists who tell us global warming. Do your own research. Find out for yourself. What do I mean by conspiracy theorists, by the way? It's not a great phrase in this context because, some conspiracies are actually true. But what by conspiracy theorists I mean in this context is people who espouse views which are not necessarily conspiracies, which is why it's not, another reason it's not a great phrase here, but often are conspiracies or involve conspiracies, which are contrary to the mainstream opinion, and where the mainstream opinion is a very widely held opinion by the relevant experts. So I mean people who say, for example, that the Trump assassination attempt was staged, or the moon landing was faked, or the COVID vaccine was designed to kill us all, or global warming is a Chinese hoax. All of these people, if you argue with them online, say, don't be one of the sheeple. Don't just go along with what people tell you, like, a gullible fool. Do your own research. Now, that's an interesting line because, for a philosopher, it hits home, because these things, like, think for yourself. That's why I want to say, hey, that's our line, us philosophers. That's what we say. So here are three great Enlightenment philosophers, John Locke, René Descartes, and Immanuel Kant. And all of them very famously said things that look a lot like do your own research. So John Locke, the great English philosopher, said, we may as rationally hope to see with other men's eyes as to know with other men's understandings. You have to know for yourself or you can't know at all. Descartes' meditations, which is so famous for the cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, it actually starts by saying, I realize it's autobiographical. I'm sitting here in this room, this heated room in front of the fire. And I realize that everything I take myself to know, I know on the word of other people. But that's not real knowledge, Descartes says. It's only if I know for myself that it's real knowledge. How do I know these people aren't misleading me? And he goes through all these examples about how we all know, according to him. It's not something I know, but he says we all know that something that's the product of many hands is always worse than the product of an individual. So we should always find out for ourselves. And then Kant, in this very famous essay called What is Enlightenment, defines enlightenment. So the Enlightenment is a period in intellectual history which is more or less identified with the motto, think for yourself. The idea is the Enlightenment reject church dogma in favor of the authority of reason. And Kant wrote at a time of great intellectual ferment, well into the Enlightenment, and asked to define enlightenment, he said, enlightenment is emergence from immaturity. And immaturity is the inability to use your own understanding without the guidance of another. So all of these philosophers, these very famous, very great philosophers, these are, some of the greatest philosophers in history, they all espouse views that look very much like do your own research. Think for yourself. Don't take other people's words for it. They seem to be agreeing with the conspiracy theorists. Well, how do we respond? A common response is to think, well, the conspiracy theorists are right. We should do our own research. They're right in what they say. They're wrong in what they do. They talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. They say, do your own research, but really they're incredibly credulous. So as this cartoon has it, they say, I'm going to do my own research, but then they click on the first link and say, well, that's it, I'm going to believe that. Now, of course, there are lots of credulous conspiracy theorists out there. We all encounter these people who've encountered some meme on Facebook and think that's more reliable than the CDC or the scientists or whatever it might be, and say, do your own research when they're just relying on some meme on Facebook. But lots of conspiracy theorists aren't like that. If you spend much time inquiring, talking to them or reading them, you discover lots of them spent an enormous time doing their own research, reading all the mainstream stuff they can get their hands on and all the the non-mainstream stuff as well. Excuse me. So, for example, this is James Fetzer. James Fetzer is a philosopher of science, a well-known philosopher of science, quite respected. He's now retired, who has published extensively on philosophy of science, and his work is respected. But he's also published extensively on conspiracy theories, and he espouses a number of them. He's a 9/11 truther. That is to say, he thinks that 9/11 was an inside job. The government brought the Twin Towers down. And he thinks that many of the famous American school shootings, like Sandy Hook, were inside jobs. He thinks they're false flag operations, that the US government staged them and then framed someone. I don't know what he thinks the motive is, but a common motive people give for false flag operations is to take away guns, in which case they're not doing a really good job of it. But in any case, whatever else you think of him, you've got to admit James Fetzer does his research. He writes these long books which are full of footnotes. He's read everything, and he's highly intelligent, and he's by no means unusual. There's a nice paper written by former colleagues of mine in Australia, analyzing r/conspiracy. R/ is the designation for a subreddit. That's a Reddit discussion page on the social media site Reddit. R/conspiracy is the subreddit devoted to conspiracy theorists. And the analysis found that the people who were most active on R/conspiracy were very concerned with evidence. They were very discerning in the conspiracies they accepted. So, for example, those who were most active, if you went there and said, this was a conspiracy, they tell you, no, that's the mainstream view is right on that point. Don't say that, because that makes us look bad. These conspiracy theories, these are the true ones. These are intelligent people doing their best to really do their own research. There's no reason to think that they're less intelligent than people who accept the mainstream view on average. Genuinely doing your own research, it really's got to be stressed, is hard. So I've taken this passage from a book by Rex Fleming. Rex Fleming wrote a book, I can't remember what it's called. You can Google it. It's published by Springer. The author, as I said, is Rex Fleming, in which he argues that climate change can't be occurring and it's all just a hoax. And he says it can't be occurring in the book due to the failure of the Schwarzschild radiation integrations to maintain the CO2 long-wave radiation intensity achieved in the surface warming by H2O and CO2. The resultant Planck radiation intensity is severely depleted in the upper atmosphere. The result is the CO2 molecules merely pass their remaining small residual heat to space unimpeded. Now, if I want to think for myself, that who's right here? Is it James Hansen or Michael Mann or Will Steffen, all of whom are, climate scientists who say climate change is an enormous problem due to the greenhouse effects, or Rex Fleming, who says, no, it isn't? How do I go about it? I don't know what Rex Fleming is saying in this passage, never mind. I mean, I have a vague idea. He's saying that CO2 is not a greenhouse gas, but I can't evaluate it because I don't know what he's talking about. I mean, I could do a lot of research, but it would be a long ramp even to understand it. I've shown this passage to other people who are not experts in climate change and asked them what they think. These are people who think you should do your own research. And they said, oh, that's easy to dismiss because that's just sciencey words. That doesn't mean anything. Well, maybe they're right, but I doubt it, because Rex Fleming actually has a PhD in atmospheric physics from the University of Michigan, which is a good university. He directed the Office of Climate and Atmospheric Research, the National Oceanographic Institute, and he's got 200 publications in decent journals. He appears to have the credentials. I doubt he's just stringing sciencey words together. He's making an argument. Now, I'm actually confident the argument is wrong, but not because I can evaluate it. So on what basis am I confident the argument is wrong? It's also important to emphasize that not even scientists can check for themselves very often. Science is highly specialized, It's very common in science for a scientist to use a tool that other scientists have designed and which they don't have the capacity to design or to really drill down into the details of themselves. So, for example, in neuroscience, physicists are heavily involved in the design of fMRI machines. Neuroscientists work them, but they can't do the physics behind fMRI machines. Science is heavily collaborative, and just for practical reasons, even on one paper, one scientist can't check the work of the other people involved. There's a very famous paper by John Hardwick, a philosopher of science, from 1985. So 1985, nearly 40 years ago, in which he interviewed physicists involved in producing a major physics paper. And he interviewed the physicists and he asked them, okay, how was this result calculated? What is this part doing? What's the explanation for this? And every scientist he interviewed said, I can't explain that bit. I can explain this bit, but not that bit. I didn't do that bit. Even if they had the skills to check that, just for practical reasons, they couldn't do it. There were 99 authors on this paper. And it was literally hundreds and hundreds of hours of work for every component. So for practical reasons, no scientist is in the position to check all the others. This is completely normal. That was 1985. The Higgs boson paper was 5,000 authors. Author number has ramped up considerably. And even I publish a little in psychology. I published multiple papers with hundreds of authors. And I'm definitely not in a position of explaining every part of the paper. In fact, I can normally explain much less of the paper than many other people, but none of them, no author can explain every bit completely. It's not just science. The famous public humiliation of Naomi Wolf. Naomi Wolf is a conspiracy theorist these days. This was before she really jumped the shark, because she had this awful experience, which I have a lot of sympathy for her about, where she went on radio in the UK being interviewed about her new book. The new book was about an increase in, she claimed, an increase in intolerance towards homosexuality in 19th century Britain. And a central piece of evidence for her case was the use of the phrase death recorded in sentences for what was then called sodomy. It was very rare prior to the mid-19th century. After that, it became quite common. And she said, see, the death sentence became much more common. And the interviewer, who happened to have a PhD in cultural history and happened to have specialized in just this bit of the law, said, that's not what death recorded means. It means just the opposite. It means the judge found that though the death sentence was appropriate, they had decided to commute it. It was, if anything, evidence against her thesis rather than for it. Now, at the time, as I say, incredibly embarrassing for her, and possibly plays a role in her subsequently becoming a conspiracy theory. At the time, lots of people said, where were the fact checkers? But she actually employed fact checkers. She employed, to check the law, Dame Helena Kennedy, a leading legal expert who interpreted the phrase in exactly the same way she did. The thing was, it wasn't enough to be a legal expert. You needed to be an expert in just that area of 19th century law. It's highly, highly specialized. We think, history, it doesn't have the same barriers to entry as physics. You look at a physics paper and you think, well, I don't know what's going on here. A history paper, I can read it. Still, the capacity to assess it, really assess it, may take expertise that we don't have. So what do we do? If anything, I think that, doing our own research runs risks. If you think to yourself, okay, I'm not going to trust one side or the other, I'm not going to trust the CDC or the people on Facebook who say the vaccines are dangerous, I'm going to do my own research. You're not allocating trust to either side. And you don't have the capacity to assess it for yourself. And I think it takes real expertise, not just having read a few Wikipedia articles or even a textbook. I think it takes a lot more than that. If you don't trust well, I think, you're really just going to be led by the superficial qualities of arguments, which ones seem more persuasive. And that may reflect debating skill more than it reflects the real evidence. So we are really vulnerable to experts. We're in this position of needing to make decisions about things that we don't have the capacity really to assess for ourselves. But we also value intellectual autonomy. We do value making up our own minds. So what can we do? I actually don't have a good answer. One thing we can do is be an expert on something. I think most of us are capable of being an expert on something. And, being an expert on something can make a real difference. There have been a number of episodes in medical history where communities who've had experience of a particular thing, for example, the gay community with experience of HIV, or minority communities with experience, of differential impact of disease. They've been able to tell the medical experts, here's what you're missing. And often the medical experts have, resisted this, but they've turned out to be right. The local expertise, how this impacts us, has actually made a difference to, the evolution of the understanding of medicine. So I think we can all be experts on something, or at least most of us can aspire to be experts on something. We can also defer better. Deferring is taking expert advice. So, I don't think most of us, are really genuinely gullible. I think gullibility is actually quite rare. So what do I do, for example, when I say I'm convinced that Rex Fleming is wrong and the climate scientists are right? Is it because I can evaluate climate science? Not at all. It's because essentially, because the climate scientists are people who are vetted by institutions like universities that I trust. And why do I trust them? Well, I've got some experience with them. I also trust individuals who trust them. I have, personal relationships with individuals who trust them. So it's not that I'm being gullible in preferring the advice of the climate scientists over the dissenters, but nor is it because I'm thinking for myself about climate science. It's because I'm allocating my trust in a way that reflects, what I take to be rational. And I don't think, by the way, I'm not accusing contrarians of not doing that. I think they do that too. They trust in different people. And sometimes they have good reasons to allocate trust, as I see it, badly. So there's an American political scientist who specializes in conspiracy theories, who says conspiracy theories are for losers. And what he means by that is people who have lost out are much more likely to be conspiracy theorists. So, for example, in America, whichever party's in power who has the presidency, conspiracy theories are more common on the other side, Democrats when Republicans in power, and vice versa. Why? Because they don't trust government institutions as much. And people who have no particular reason to trust government under any conditions, poorer communities, for example, they tend to trust less, and that might be rational for them. Unfortunately, it leaves them vulnerable because the people who step in don't tend to be more trustworthy than people who are looking to exploit them in one way or another. So we can check whether we're responding to good signals. We can also look for evidence of their incentives and their track records. By incentives, I mean, as in the mechanics case, What's the mechanics incentive to deceive me about something being wrong with my car? If they're going to have to supply the parts anyway, then they've got less incentive to deceive me about the car needing new parts. Do the climate scientists have incentives to deceive us? Well, they might have. Conspiracy theorists talk about their climate scientists wish for grants, which is true. Scientists are highly grant dependent, although grants that had a credible case against climate science would also seem to be extremely easy to fund. We can look at their track records, by which I mean both their records of prediction and also their records of credentials, degrees, obviously, prizes, awards, publications, and particularly, I think, to the degree to which their opinion is the consensus. I think that's the big one, because consensus really is a pretty reliable guide to truth. And that's especially in science, which has this structure of criticism. So when a consensus emerges, it's not likely to reflect groupthink, because it has this structure in which people attempt to refute one another. That's how you get ahead in science. It's also how peer review works. The peer reviewer attempts to show what's wrong with the paper. It's very normal to say, here's a problem with the paper, and I'm not accepting the paper until you do a further study to rule that out. Very common in science. Now, none of this is genuinely thinking for ourselves in the sense of what Kant called for, which is thinking for ourselves without the guidance of others. It's just the opposite. It's using the guidance of others well. So I don't think, Kant said we must emerge from the immaturity that consists in guiding our authority, understanding with the guidance of others. I think we can't do that, and we shouldn't do that. Instead, the best we can do is to think for ourselves about how to respond to experts and to do so intelligently. But as I say, I don't have any fully satisfactory answer. So I'm interested to hear what you have to say.